Hello class. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 15, Part 2, which is going to be our evidence of evolution. If you happen to be using the notes packet, then we're going to go through 4 evidences of evolution and then some examples in your notes packet. So it's 2 pages, basically, or a front and a back in your notes packet. So take a look and find that here. All right, so the first evidence is the fossil record, and we've really already talked about this in the past couple of sets of notes where we were looking at how did life begin, what are the first cells like. When we look at the fossil record itself, we know that lowest layers of rock had no fossils, and then they moved to be more complex as you go up the rock layers. So basically a fossil record is going to help us to look at links between modern forms and any ancestors that maybe are extinct at this point, different species or a species that has evolved to what we see today. And so we notice these transition species. There's a couple ways that we can look at age of materials and these fossils or bone structures. And so we have relative age, which is comparing the age of a particular fossil or set of bones to other fossils by looking at the geological timescale, or basically the rock layer that that particular fossil or set of bones is found in. The absolute age is radiometric dating or radioactive dating. So in that one, we would look at the actual age based on the radioactivity that's remaining in that particular rock layer or possibly fossil. Okay, so here's just some pictures to show you some examples of how the fossil evidence would show change over time. And so this is millions of years on the left and the evolution of a horse. And we see that we have kind of this transition to what we see today in a horse. Okay, number 2 is biogeography. So the geography of living things is what that word means. And it's going to be our geographical distribution of the species. So new organisms will arise in the same area, the general geographic area where similar forms already lived. And so this is going to show us that we see that transition from something, an original kind of form of an organism, to kind of the things that we see today. Some examples: Australia has native wolves, cats, mice, moles, and anteaters. Most mammals are marsupials. And so in this case, we're seeing how even from the original forms that we're finding in fossil record or bone structure are very similar to what we see today. They're just kind of transitions from what we used to see or what used to be here. Just to show you a picture of an ancient Irish elk, similar to the elk we have today, but slightly different to the European elk. Okay, number 3 is anatomy and embryology. So there's going to be a few things that fit in this. If you're doing the notes packet, there's actually going to be 4 main kind of bullet points to put in under this. So you may run out of room. You may need to go further than the spot that's given to you. Anatomy and embryology is going to look at the structures that we see in organisms today, but we may also see in bone structures that are found by paleontologists, but also bone structures that we see from one organism to the next. So homologous structures are structures that are similar in different species. So they occur in different species, but they seem to have originated from a common ancestor. And the key here is that they have different functions, but they look similar. So if you take a look at these bone structures from turtle to human, horse, bird, bat, and seal, notice they all have a humerus. They all have that upper arm bone. They all have a radius and ulna. They all have carpals, which are wrist bones for us. They all have metacarpals, which are your hand bones, and they all have phalanges, which are your fingers. And so the same bone structure, homologous structure, it's the same structures, are in different species, but they do different things. So for a human, we obviously are using that as our arm bone, but a turtle is using it almost as a leg, horse more as a leg, bird as a wing. So you can see that their structure is similar, but their function is slightly different. You can see that in this image as well. So this would indicate that there was possibly a common ancestor that has evolved over time to do the different things or have the different functions that each of these animals would have. Another example here is a skull, comparative anatomy of the skulls between a human skull and a chimpanzee skull, meaning that there was possibly a common ancestor, and then evolution or changing or modifications from that common ancestor led to two different species. Okay, the next one is analogous structures. So notice the beginning of that word changes slightly. So in this one, the body part has similar functions, but they don't have the same necessarily structure that's there. So it's a body part similar in function to another organism because of environmental pressures. And that means because they needed to fly, in this example, a bat and a bird. They needed to fly, so they have a similar structure, but they didn't develop necessarily from the same common ancestor. So an example here, the wings of a fly, a moth, and a bird developed independently of each other because they needed to fly. Because of competition, they found that they could get more food or more resources based on the ability to fly. Okay, so analogy versus homology. So homologous structures, human, bird, porpoise, elephant, have similar bone structures. Analogy is the bird and the fly both have wings, but they don't necessarily have similar structures inside of that. They basically develop them because of environmental pressures of needing to be able to fly in order to survive. Okay, our next one is vestigial structures, and this is a part of an organism that has little or no function, but it did have a function in maybe a previous species or a previous organism that has it's just come out of use now in our current organism. So a couple examples here. This one is going to be our tailbone. So the human tailbone doesn't have any use, but it might link us back to a possible common ancestor that did have a use for a tailbone or a tail. So an example there, human coccyx, which is the tailbone, and then example with the monkey tail just to show you a tail. Okay, another example would be goosebumps in an animal. This is very useful for insulation and emotional display. In humans, it doesn't really have a function. It happens maybe when you're really cold and you might shiver, but the goosebump itself does not have a lot of function there for us. Okay, and then this is just showing you a transitional fossil that links the past and the present. So you can see there the kind of what looks more like a leg, but it's actually used as a fin in this organism. Okay, and then number 4 in this section is comparative embryology. So in this one, we're studying structures that appear during the embryonic development and looking at similarities. So an example here, all vertebrate embryos go through a stage in which they have gill pouches on the sides of their throats. So very early embryos retain similarities, fish, reptile, bird, and human. And there's similarities there between each of these organisms, which would possibly indicate a common ancestor. You can see here just another image of that. Okay, so our next evidence of evolution is molecular biology, and this will be on the next page if you're in your notes packet. And in this one, we're comparing DNA to RNA to protein, and so we're looking at that amino acid sequence, and we've done this back in chapter 10. We looked at DNA, how it gets copied to RNA, and then how that gets kind of translated into amino acid sequence, which would be a protein. So if we have more similarities of that DNA to amino acid sequence, then we would assume that those organisms are more closely related through a common ancestor. And it would show common descent from a common ancestor. If you have fewer amino acid changes or DNA changes, sequence changes, then the idea would be that you're more closely related. If you have a lot of differences, then you would be kind of more distantly related based on different species. And so again, we'd be looking at our amino acid chart, and the more protein sequences that you have that are the same, you would assume you have a common ancestor with that other organism. So we're going to go through some examples here, and you have this on your notes packet as well. Basically, we're going to take the statement and kind of link it to one of these examples or one of these evidences. So identify the evidence with the examples below, either fossil evidence, homologous structure, embryology, vestigial organs, or biochemical, which would be DNA. Biochemical is just our DNA. So the first one here, bones in the bird's wing and the human's arm are similar in structure. So take a moment, you may pause here and see if you can identify which of those 5 evidences it would be. Pull all these up first. All organisms use ATP to transfer energy. There are similarities in structure among the early stages of fish, birds, and humans. Humans, unlike rabbits, have no known use for their appendix. Horses have increased in size and decreased in number of toes since the Eocene period. So if we're going to identify these particular statements with their evidence, I'll write them up here next to them. So try and do that on your notes packet and I'll write them up. Okay, so bones in the bird's wing and human's arm are similar in structure. Is going to be homologous structure. Organisms use ATP to transfer energy is biochemical. Similarities in structure among the early stages of fish, birds, and humans is embryology. Humans have no known use for their appendix. That's going to be vestigial organ. And horses have increased in size and decreased in number of toes is going to be fossil evidence. Okay, and then the last thing to go over today is phylogeny, and this is a relationship by ancestry among groups of organisms. So we look at this tree of life and basically link organisms together based on these evidences that we've looked at today. And so you can see here an example down below. Basically, we would have different trees based on possibly their relationship to each other, to different organisms. And basically down here, what you would see then is a common ancestor that then branches based on evolution, based on changes that are needed for that environment to be different organisms that we know today. Here's another example of one that we could look at, a tree of life for this different organism, mosquitoes and flies. That's the last one I have on here. We will practice some of these and we'll be looking at some in a lab that we'll do together.